In Lecture 6, we'll compare voltaic and electrolytic cells. Voltaic cells we've talked about previously, and we've also called voltaic cells batteries. But in this chapter, we'll also introduce the concept of electrolytic cells. The actual examples of electrolytic cells we'll keep till the second part of this lecture. We'll give some specific examples of voltaic cells or batteries in the first part of the lecture, but this very first slide, we want to just compare the two types of electrochemical cells in general before we go on and give specific examples of voltaic cells, and then, as I said, in part 2 of this lecture, to give specific examples of electrolytic cells. Now, as we've defined before, a voltaic cell is where a spontaneous redox reaction produces electricity or a flow of electrons. What are some examples of voltaic cells? Well, as I've just said, batteries are the most common example of a voltaic cell, and we've actually talked about several different kinds previously. Typically, they consist of two separate beakers or two half cells connected by a wire in a salt bridge. Now, when these voltaic cells are packaged and commercialized, we call them batteries. Fuel cells are another type of voltaic cell. These are batteries where instead of having all the reagents self-contained, there's a continuous supply of reagents from the outside, or fuel, that sustains the spontaneous redox reaction indefinitely, or at least until the fuel runs out. Corrosion is a process that we're all quite familiar with, but corrosion also is a type of voltaic cell when there's a spontaneous redox reaction that's set up on a metal surface. Well, then, what's an electrolytic cell? Well, in an electrolytic cell, what you're doing is you have a non-spontaneous redox reaction, which of course would be useless to produce electricity. But what you can do here is actually put electrical energy into the cell from the outside and drive a non-spontaneous redox reaction that would not ordinarily occur. So in an electrolytic cell, we flipped everything on its head from a voltaic cell. In a voltaic cell, you have a spontaneous redox reaction and you harness the flow of electrons that comes from that. In an electrolytic cell, you have a non-spontaneous redox reaction that you'd like to get going or push, and so you input electrical energy to do that. Well, the process occurring in an electrolytic cell is called electrolysis. What are some examples? Well, quite simply, recharging a battery, if the battery is indeed rechargeable, requires input of electricity to drive the relevant redox reaction back up the energy hill. So remember, a voltaic cell will run on a spontaneous redox reaction as written left to right. If you want to recharge the battery, you'd have to push that reaction in the opposite direction, up an energy hill, so you'd have to put electricity or electrical energy in to make that happen. So recharging a battery is an example of electrolysis. We all like to drink soda. We usually drink it out of aluminum metal cans. The industrial production of aluminum requires a large input of electricity. Aluminum metal is produced by electrolysis in large electrolytic cells because the chemical reaction or the redox reaction to produce aluminum is incredibly non-spontaneous. So you have to put in a large amount of electrical energy to push that reaction in the non-spontaneous direction and make it work to produce aluminum metal. Some metal plating operations would be done by electrolysis using sunlight to provide energy for the non-spontaneous splitting of water into hydrogen and oxygen, and then using the hydrogen and oxygen later as a fuel mixture would be another example of electrolysis done in an electrolytic cell. So we'll begin our discussion with examples of 3 types of commercial batteries. Remember, batteries were the first Voltaic cell on our list. We'll talk about a non-rechargeable alkaline battery, for example, an Energizer AAA that is still used in TV remotes and wireless keyboards and wireless mice. We'll talk about a car battery. This is old technology that still helps start our car and get us where we're going. This is a rechargeable lead acid battery. And then we'll talk about a rechargeable lithium ion battery, with which you're probably most familiar with that terminology that's running your laptop or your phone. Now, as an aside here, sometimes non-rechargeable batteries are called primary batteries, and rechargeable batteries are sometimes called secondary batteries. And it is probably true that that's the last time you'll ever hear me use that vocabulary. But this is commonly in textbooks, so I thought I'd put it up here on the slide. So let's look at a non-rechargeable alkaline battery. The reactions that occur in a non-rechargeable alkaline battery we could sum up like this. At the anode, remember that's where oxidation would occur. We have zinc metal in the presence of a high concentration of hydroxide being oxidized to zinc 2+, which releases 2 electrons. And remember, in a voltaic cell, the anode has a negative charge, but more importantly, the anode is where oxidation occurs. At the cathode, which would be positively charged, at the cathode is where reduction always occurs. And the reduction reaction that's typical is manganese dioxide, where manganese is in the +4 oxidation state, is reduced to manganese oxide hydroxide, a rather strange compound, but most importantly, manganese is in the +3 oxidation state. And since 2 are involved, 2 manganese dioxides and 2 manganese oxide hydroxides, there's a transfer of 2 electrons going on here. And so the overall reaction, crossing out the 2 electrons on either side of the arrows, crossing out the hydroxides on either side of the arrows, and we get the fact that zinc metal plus manganese dioxide with the involvement of some water produces zinc hydroxide in this manganese oxide hydroxide compound. Here's a schematic of what I'm sure you're telling me right now, or like to tell me right now, is not a AAA battery. I would agree with you. This is the best diagram I could find. And so we'll assume that this C or D battery, which is also comes as a non-rechargeable alkaline battery, would have the same or very similar components as a AAA battery. In the middle of the battery, we have powdered zinc, and this powdered zinc is the anode, because remember up here, we have the anode being solid zinc. It's suspended in concentrated potassium hydroxide. That's the source of the hydroxide. And this also serves as an electrolyte, which assists with total charge flow. The negative terminal of the battery, which we said negative was with the anode, would be connected to the zinc anode. The cathode consists of this manganese dioxide, and so there's a layer of manganese dioxide here, and the positive or top terminal would be connected to this manganese dioxide cathode. There's a separator that separates the cathode from the anode, made of porous fabric. There's a metal alloy down the middle of the zinc anode, which serves as a current collector. Now that has to do with an engineering feature of the battery. There's of course a steel can that encloses all of this and protects you from the very caustic potassium hydroxide. And then of course someone has to put an outer jacket on it with some pretty graphics that displays the company name, the type of battery, and so forth. Now when in use, of course, electrons would flow from the anode, which is the negative electrode, through the circuit, and then they'd flow back into the cathode. As I said before, this of course doesn't look like a AAA battery, but these diagrams I had a hard time finding a good one, and so this is the best I could do for a diagram, and I think it did a pretty good job. I obtained a sample data sheet from the Energizer product website, and basically this would be, and they were examining the battery performance in a TV remote. The thing I just want to show you here is that they're monitoring voltage as a function of service time, and you can see they were interested in how the voltage drops with the number of hours of constant use of this TV remote. You look at this and say, gee, my TV remote lasts more than a day. Well, you only push the button when you want something to happen. You don't have it on continuously. Okay, let's look at the battery that started your car, most likely. Today, if you used your car. Now, when acting as a voltaic cell, which is what your car battery would be doing when it supplies electrical energy to the starter motor, that would be called the discharge of the battery. The relevant redox reactions are at the anode where oxidation is occurring. There is lead metal, which also involves hydrogen sulfate ions in the electrolyte, but most importantly, lead metal is oxidized to lead sulfate. So it's lead 0 to lead 2 plus, releasing 2 electrons. Notice hydrogen ions are also involved here. And at the cathode, where reduction occurs, lead dioxide or lead 4 oxide, where lead has a +4 oxidation state, lead +4 is reduced to lead 2 plus and lead sulfate, also with the involvement of hydrogen ions and hydrogen sulfate. Notice this odd thing about the battery where the product of both the oxidation and the reduction are the same, lead sulfate. So the overall reaction here, crossing out some things, is lead dioxide plus lead metal plus hydrogen sulfate and hydrogen ions making lead sulfate and water. So during discharge, when it's acting as a battery, or as I should say as a voltaic cell, lead 4 oxide and lead metal are combined along with sulfuric acid, because as I'll point out soon, sulfuric acid is really the combination of these hydrogen ions and hydrogen sulfate. Here's a graphic of a battery that I altered for my purposes here. This should look familiar. You have the terminals of the battery. The cathode and anode labels and signs are for discharge mode here. The anode is a lead grid filled with what's called spongy lead. This is not all that well depicted in this figure, but when we write the anode as solid lead, it's actually a grid of lead that's filled with spongy lead. It's all just lead, the element. The cathode is a lead grid filled with lead dioxide. Now, this is in red here, and this seems rather strange because the cathode reaction up here just says lead dioxide. It doesn't talk about the lead that's there. This is again, an engineering question. The chemistry would tell us it's lead dioxide being reduced. And then the electrolyte is the sulfuric acid dissolved in water that fills the spaces between the plates. So that's the electrolyte that's between all the anodes and cathodes. If you have 6 cells, and what we mean by a cell would be a pair of lead grids filled with spongy lead paired up with a lead grid filled with lead dioxide. Each one produces about 2 volts in discharge mode, and if you connect 6 of them in electrical connection called a series connection, you get a total voltage of 12 volts. Now, the lead battery can act as an electrolytic cell during charging when the alternator is doing work to recharge the battery. So if the battery has produced lead sulfate, what the alternator or generator will do in your car is push this reaction backwards in the non-spontaneous direction to reform the lead and the lead dioxide. So the oxidation reaction under electrolytic conditions, when you're pushing the reaction backwards, would be lead sulfate and water returning to lead dioxide and hydrogen sulfate and hydrogen ions. So this is basically the cathode reaction here from the Voltaic cell discharge being pushed backwards. And so we have lead 2 plus being oxidized back up to lead 4 plus, and at the cathode during the electrolytic cell portion, or the charging mode, would be lead sulfate being reduced back to lead. So in the charging mode, we have lead sulfate being oxidized to lead 4 plus at the anode, lead sulfate being reduced to lead at the cathode. If we write the overall reaction here and cancel out the appropriate items, we get the original reaction written backwards. So during recharging, we have accumulated lead sulfate and water converted back to lead 4 oxide or lead dioxide, lead metal, and sulfuric acid. Now the density of the electrolyte is measured by a simple hydrometer, which is basically a little tube you suck up some electrolyte in, and there's little floating plastic balls, like tiny little ping pong balls floating, and from the number that float, sometimes you can tell the density of the electrolyte. It's a good measure of the state of the battery. You'll note that during discharge above, that sulfuric acid, which is written as 2HSO4 minus and 2H plus, is being converted, or lost, is being converted to water and lead sulfate, along with the lead, of course. So you're losing sulfuric acid during discharge, and during charging mode, you're producing sulfuric acid. Sulfuric acid is actually more dense than water. So if the electrolyte shows a really low density, it means that the battery has been too discharged. If the electrolyte shows a good density, it means that the battery has been charged up properly. How about lithium-ion batteries? Well, a lithium battery is a clever device because lithium metal and also lithium ions are very lightweight. So constructing a battery where lithium ions play a major role would seem to be a clever way of maximizing the energy density of a battery. If we think of energy density as the energy produced divided by the mass of the battery. If you reduce the mass of the battery, which is in the denominator of this fraction, the energy density will increase. Lithium batteries, of course, are now the choice for electronic devices, cordless power tools, electric vehicles. What we'll do here is try to show you an oversimplified generic diagram of a lithium-ion battery in what's called discharge mode. Just like in the car battery, This is acting in discharge mode, where it's acting as a voltaic cell. It's producing electricity for us through a spontaneous process occurring within the battery. This diagram certainly looks different from previous diagrams. We'll try to slowly work our way through this. What we have on the left here in the anode area are layers of graphite. Graphite is a planar carbon structure, and over on the right, on the cathode side, we have layers of a metal oxide, which of course means some metal plus oxide ions. The oxide ions would be in red, the metal ion is in blue here. Now, when acting as a voltaic cell during discharge, what happens is lithium ions move out of the spaces between the layers of the graphite and move through the electrolyte and enter the spaces between the metal oxide layers. Now, simultaneously, to maintain charge balance, if you've got a positive charge going from left to right, then a negative charge also has to go from left to right to keep the two electrodes perfectly neutral. So this flow of lithium ions is causing a current flow in the outer circuit, which we can use to measure or use to power a device. Well, the lithium ions, excuse me, are what's called intercalated, meaning put like a sandwich. They would be the inside of a bread sandwich, intercalated between these graphite layers. And then the lithium ions, as I said, take up residency or intercalate into spaces between the metal oxide layers. Now, if the metal was cobalt, the half reactions could be written like this. The oxidation reaction would be a lithium atom intercalated or associated with a C6, which would be a planar graphite structure, is turned into a lithium ion. The carbon is left, of course, alone, and this produces an electron that goes through the outer circuit. One might ask, this doesn't look like a lithium ion here. That actually looks like lithium metal, and we're always talking about just lithium ions, and the figure implied that there's just lithium ions. In fact, there's an arrow calling this a lithium ion that moves. So what we're assuming here in our diagram is that the lithium ion is already formed from the lithium atom, and now it's ready to move from one side to the other. In any event, this is the best we could do to write the oxidation reaction at the anode, because we're producing an electron and a lithium ion. Now, the reduction at the cathode would involve a lithium ion, of course, the electron that comes over from the left-hand side. And if we're talking about cobalt, a typical metal oxide involving cobalt would be cobalt 4 oxide. So we have cobalt 4 being reduced to cobalt 3. We've produced an anion here that's like one of our polyatomic ions, and it's now associated with the lithium ion that has come across from the left. Now, when acting as an electrolytic cell, meaning when you're recharging the battery by plugging it into a charging station, the lithium ion movement and the direction of current flow are reversed. So when you plug it into your charger, you're driving the lithium ions back from the right-hand side over to the left-hand side. Now, lithium-ion batteries have unique chemistries and are the center of highly competitive and secretive research and development efforts by numerous corporations. This is why the only thing that's available is this generic diagram. And there is intense research going on in many labs around the world to find ways to tweak the efficiencies and the current densities of devices like this. And they involve some pretty detailed and ingenious schemes to maximize the current density and the power that you can get from a lithium-ion battery. Let's look at fuel cells. This was the last on our list of batteries that we were going to consider. And in this case, we'll look at a hydrogen-oxygen fuel cell, and I have an actual photo of a fuel cell-powered public transit bus in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. Now recall the spontaneous and under the right conditions explosive reaction between hydrogen and oxygen gas to form water. It has an incredibly negative delta G. The overall potential of this reaction is plus 1.23 volts. We can divide it into two half reactions. If we read these reactions off our table of standard reduction potentials, we'd have hydrogen gas forming hydrogen ions, and we'd have oxygen gas being reduced by electrons with the involvement of hydrogen ions producing water, and the overall reaction is hydrogen plus oxygen producing liquid water with a voltage of plus 1.23 volts. So this is a spontaneous redox reaction we'd like to harness. If we found a way to actually physically divide the hydrogen and the oxygen in a device and make the electrons that want to go from hydrogen to oxygen and cause an explosion actually go through a circuit and power a device or a bus and not explode but exploit the energy difference, we can design a fuel cell. The oxygen can be supplied by just sucking air into the fuel cell. The battery would never die as long as there's a source of hydrogen available, so you'd need a hydrogen tank. And the cool thing here is that the product of the reaction is just water, so no one can say that this actual reaction is producing greenhouse gases or other harmful pollutants. Here's a simple cartoon of what we call a PEM fuel cell. We call it that because it uses what's called a proton exchange membrane. And let's take a minute to dissect what's going on here. Down at the bottom, it says fuel is coming in. So this is where hydrogen gas would come in. It would flow up here, and anything that wasn't used would flow back out. The air, which is the source of oxygen, would flow in, and whatever was not used would flow back out. And this is the center gray part is the proton exchange membrane. Now, with the help of catalysts embedded in the anode right here, the hydrogen gas, this anode of course would be permeable, so any hydrogen gas actually passing through is stripped of 2 electrons, forming hydrogen ions that then go into this electrolyte or this membrane and flow from left to right toward the cathode. The electrons that are lost flow in the outer circuit, power something, go back to the cathode. The oxygens coming in from the right here, which permeate through this permeable cathode, then meet electrons and hydrogen ions to produce water. So this is also done with the help of catalysts that are embedded in the cathode. Finally, we did say that corrosion was a type of voltaic cell. So let's talk about the type of corrosion that we're all most familiar with, and that would be rusting or formation of rust, which is really hydrated iron oxide from the reaction of iron metal with oxygen from the air, and it's aided by hydrogen ions in water. Now, the relevant redox reactions can be summarized like this. Iron metal is oxidized to iron 2+. This is actually a favorable redox reaction, plus 0.44 volts. In our table, of course, it would be listed as minus 0.44 volts because this would be written as a reduction. I wrote it as an oxidation. And the reduction here would be the reduction of oxygen from the air and also involving hydrogen ions to form water. This is also favorable. So the overall reaction here would be iron and oxygen and hydrogen ions and water forming iron 2+ ions and water. The overall redox potential for this is plus 1.77 volts. This is an impressively spontaneous reaction, so it's no wonder that iron rusts so easily when left out exposed to the air. Now, if you're looking at this closely, you might say, okay, where's the rust? Well, it turns out that oxygen, again with the assistance of water, can further oxidize iron 2+ to iron 3+, allowing for a reaction that looks like this: iron 2+ and oxygen and water, and some unspecified number of water molecules, forming iron 3 oxide with an unspecified number of water molecules. This is what we call hydrated iron oxide, and 8 hydrogen ions. The iron here, of course, is oxidized from +2 to +3 by the oxygen, and this formula here is our hydrated iron 3 oxide, which we would consider to be rust. The X in front of the portion of the H2O liquid simply indicates that there's a variable number of water molecules involved here depending on the conditions at the time of the reaction. Here's a diagram of this process occurring on the surface of iron metal. So we have a block of gray iron metal, we have a water drop, and you might say, well, how does this process start? Well, for reasons that aren't altogether clear to to folks that first see this, and we won't spend time on this, this would be a materials question. But iron metal becomes a little more likely to oxidize at weak spots or stress points on the metal surface, or where a protective coating has been damaged. That makes more sense. And so once this process starts, where iron gives up 2 electrons, this part of the metal would be considered the anode area where oxidation is occurring. The water droplet helps with the migration of an iron 2+ ion that's formed, and that iron 2+ ion can migrate over to the area that we call the cathode area, where oxygen can combine with iron 2+ and form and get reduced. So oxygen gets reduced, and the oxygen can oxidize the iron 2+. Basically what we have here is we've set up initially our redox reaction up here that we said was very spontaneous. Iron being oxidized to iron 2+, the electrons going to the surface where oxygen can combine with the electrons and form water. And in the meantime, the iron 2+ can migrate over to this area and be further oxidized by iron to hydrated iron 3 oxides. And of course, the part of the metal that's not been damaged can facilitate the transfer of electrons because metals conduct electrons. So we've basically set up a voltaic cell on a random area of the metal surface, which sets this process in motion that results in rust. Now, how might we prevent corrosion? Well, the most obvious thing is to paint the metal. So we have a picture of an individual coating a metal pipe with a paint that would keep oxygen from reacting with the metal at the surface of the pipe. Now, another method would be to use something called cathodic protection. And all this involves is connecting the iron to another metal that's hopefully not very expensive, that's even easier to oxidize than the iron and can be a sacrificial donor of electrons. So when iron reacts with oxygen, iron's donating electrons to oxygen. If we can connect the iron to a different metal that donates electrons to the oxygen more easily than the iron, then the iron wouldn't have to give up electrons, and there would be no corrosion. Two common sacrificial donors, as we call them, are zinc and magnesium. Now note from the table of the standard reduction potentials here on the right that both magnesium and zinc are easier to oxidize than iron. So recall that these are all written as reductions. So when we write these backwards as oxidations, magnesium being oxidized to magnesium 2+ is favorable by over 2 volts, plus 2.37 volts, zinc by plus 0.763 volts, iron by plus 0.440 volts. So when when oxygen approaches the iron is connected to one of these other two metals somehow, and so the oxygen takes electrons from the zinc or the magnesium instead of from the iron, sparing the iron. When you hear something that is galvanized steel, which is of course steel being mostly iron, galvanized steel is protected from rusting by a coating of zinc. So here we have this diagram that we had before when we talked about corrosion, but now the iron, which is the lighter gray, has a coating of zinc metal on it, and so the corrosion that takes place, instead of iron being involved, it's zinc undergoing the spontaneous redox reaction. And so what we have is the protection of the iron. So this reaction, iron going to iron 2+, would not occur because the zinc is easier to oxidize than the iron. So as long as the zinc lasts, as long as that coating lasts, the iron will be protected and you won't get any rust. Now if you scratch the coating of galvanized metal, yes, you're going to start to get some rust where you've scratched away the coating of zinc. Now you can also do cathodic protection by simply strapping a wire to the iron and running that wire to a sacrificial anode. The zinc here is considered a sacrificial anode, and so magnesium can also do this. So for example, if you had a buried iron pipe and you were afraid that some oxygen was going to get down into the soil here in water and you could get some rusting of this buried iron pipe, you could connect the pipe with an insulated copper wire to a piece of magnesium, and so when the oxygen comes to the pipe and demands electrons, the electrons actually flow from the magnesium and would reduce the oxygen, sparing the iron. Now again, of course, this is only going to last as long as the magnesium anode lasts. So if you did this, you'd actually have to periodically replace the magnesium metal in order to continuously protect the iron.